Chapter 9. The Lightning Network. Even the most vocal Bitcoin maximalists will insist that in the long run, there needs to be a way to make Bitcoin usable as money in everyday commerce. But they do not want the base layer to provide that functionality. Instead, they want regular payments to be conducted on secondary layers, like the Lightning Network. Small blockers have been arguing that the block size limit does not need to be raised because the Lightning Network solves Bitcoin's scaling problems. They made this argument years before the Lightning Network even existed. Despite the hype, the reality of the Lightning Network is grim. It has several critical design flaws that make it insecure, cumbersome, and unlikely to ever gain mainstream adoption. Each attempt at solving Lightning's problems has created new layers of complexity that come with new sets of problems, a terrible sign from the perspective of software development. Here's a basic overview of the Lightning Network's design. The technology is based around payment channels, which is essentially a running balance between two parties. Say, Alice opens up a payment channel with Bob and funds it with $10. The initial balance would be $10 for Alice and $0 for Bob. If she sends him a $3 transaction, the new balance would be $7 for Alice and $3 for Bob. Bob could send her back $1 and the new balance would be $8 for Alice and $2 for Bob. None of these transactions get recorded on the blockchain. Their nodes keep track of the tally separately off the chain. At any point, either party can close this channel, which then distributes the final balances to both people with an on-chain transaction. Payment channels are a neat technology that have been worked on since the beginning, even by Satoshi himself. However, they were not being worked on as a scaling solution. Instead, they were being designed for tiny micropayments and high-velocity two-way transactions, which are used in special circumstances like machine-to-machine payments. Payment channels are great for micropayments because they allow tiny amounts to be sent back and forth between parties without incurring on-chain transaction fees. The Lightning Network is an attempt to link payment channels together to create a secondary layer that can route everyday Bitcoin payments. So if Alice wants to send money to Charlie, but she does not have a payment channel open with him directly, she can route her payment through Bob, who does have a channel open with Charlie. For this service, Bob gets a tiny transaction fee. Ideally, the payments on Lightning would be instant, have extremely low fees, and could scale Bitcoin without having to increase the block size limit, since most of the transactions are happening off-chain. Unfortunately, Lightning does not work well in practice because it has several system-breaking design flaws. The most fundamental problem with a Lightning Network is that it requires on-chain transactions in order to use. Opening and closing a payment channel requires making on-chain transactions, and it is recommended to open multiple channels at the same time. These channels are not permanent either. They require ongoing maintenance and are supposed to be refreshed annually. The requirement for on-chain transactions creates two critical problems. Number one, users must pay on-chain transaction fees just to open or close channels. If the base layer is being used as a settlement system between banks, these fees could cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars just to connect to the Lightning Network. And number two, since onboarding to the Lightning Network requires on-chain transactions, it is mathematically impossible to onboard large numbers of people with 1 megabyte blocks. Problem number one is straightforward, but it's often hidden from regular users. The most popular Lightning wallets are either custodial, which means users' funds are controlled by a company, or the wallet will commonly subsidize the on-chain transaction costs. Both situations are undesirable. Custodial Lightning eliminates all the benefits of using Bitcoin in the first place, and it's only possible for companies to subsidize on-chain transaction fees while they're low. If fees are consistently above $50 or $100, there's no way that companies will continue subsidizing them. The Lightning Network does not avoid the pain of having high Layer 1 fees. Problem 2 is also straightforward and has been recognized since the Lightning white paper was written. With extremely limited block space, even if every BTC transaction was solely used for opening a payment channel, there is not enough space to onboard more than a few thousand people per block. Paul Sports, a notable BTC supporter and developer, wrote an article breaking down the numbers in more detail. He concluded that even if 90% of the block space is dedicated to opening payment channels, only around 66 million people can be onboarded per year. And that means it would take around 120 years to onboard the world to the Lightning Network. He concludes, quote, "In other words, each year we would only onboard 0.82% of the world. What's worse, if channels last merely 1 year, then by January 1st, 2025, we will need to re-onboard the people who joined on January 1st, 2024. In that world, only 0.82% of the Earth's population, max, can be bona fide Bitcoin users at any one time. Monetary network effects are very strong. You need to use the money that other people are using, so a 0.82% ceiling is not viable." End quote. Sport's proposed solution is to have a big block sidechain, explained in Chapter 13, that can onboard more users. My solution is just to use big block Bitcoin instead, which does not need the Lightning Network to be viable at a global scale. The requirement to have larger blocks is why Joseph Poon wrote in the Lightning white paper, quote, "If all transactions using Bitcoin were conducted inside a network of micropayment channels, to enable 7 billion people to make 2 channels per year with unlimited transactions inside the channel, it would require 133 megabyte blocks." End quote. This is the author of the white paper explaining that the Lightning Network at global scale would still require 133 megabyte blocks. Unlike today's small blockers, he then notes that 133 megabyte blocks are still a feasible size, saying, "Current generation desktop computers will be able to run a full node with old blocks pruned out on 2 terabytes of storage." End quote. The Lightning Network requires multiple on-chain transactions in order to use. Therefore, a 1 megabyte, 2 megabyte, or even 10 megabyte block size limit would make it impossible to be a real scaling solution. Regular users are not going to be eager to spend $50 or $100 to open a payment channel, but even if they were, the BTC block size limit is simply too small to accommodate mass usage. The Lightning Network also requires users to run their own nodes. This fact famously perplexed Tone Vays, the popular Bitcoin personality. He apparently did not understand this basic feature despite relentlessly promoting the Lightning Network as an alternative to block size increases. The following is a quote from a YouTube conversation between him and Jimmy Song. They start by fielding a question from the audience. Quote, "Here's a question for you, Jimmy. Somebody says, what benefit do I get from setting up my own Lightning node?" You can go and pay people, like in Lightning." "Wait a minute. I need clarification on that. Do I need to have my own Lightning node in order to pay people through Lightning?" "Yes." "Really?" "Yes, because the only way you can pay anyone is by having a channel, and you can't have a channel unless you have a node." "But do you need your own node, or do you need somebody else's?" "You need your own node." "Oh, wow. So every single person might need their own Lightning node." "Yeah." End conversation. The requirement to run your own node is difficult enough for everyday users because the nodes require ongoing monitoring and maintenance. But there's an additional requirement that makes it crippling. Each node has to remain online or they risk losing funds. The way Lightning is designed, while a payment channel is open, both parties have a history of all the previous states the channel has been in. An individual record for when Alice had $10 and Bob had $0, and then when Alice had $7 and Bob had $3, etc. When a channel closes, the final balance is broadcast by whichever party is closing the channel. However, instead of broadcasting the most recent balances, they can broadcast previous states of the channel, which allows Alice to potentially steal from Bob. Imagine that their last transactions resulted in a balance of $1 for Alice and $9 for Bob. If Alice closes the channel, instead of broadcasting the latest balance, she can broadcast an earlier state with an old balance, like when she had $10 and Bob had $0. If Bob does not catch her, then Alice will end up stealing a total of $9. The Lightning Network tries to solve this problem by making it risky to publish old channel states. If Bob catches Alice within a 2-week time frame, he can broadcast a newer state, demonstrating that Alice published an old one. If this happens, all the funds in the channel go to Bob. This is supposed to provide an incentive to not cheat, but it's a weak one. If Alice already has a low or zero balance on the channel, she does not have much to lose by trying to steal. Also, in order to catch somebody, a node is required to be connected to the internet. If Bob's node goes offline, he can't tell whether Alice is stealing from him, and he can lose funds. This is why some Lightning proponents have suggested having a battery backup for nodes. Lightning developers have tried to fix this problem by creating so-called watchtowers, which are third parties that watch over the channel to make sure nobody's cheating, even if one node goes offline. This new system adds another layer of complexity, and it requires watchtowers to be trustworthy and competent. Otherwise, users can lose their funds. The problem of trust is simply pushed back one more step. In other words, the watchtowers need their own watchtowers. In addition to the security risk, offline nodes cannot even accept payments, nor can they route payments for other people. Lightning requires both parties to be online at the same time, and the sender cannot send an arbitrary amount of Bitcoin to the recipient. The recipient must generate a specific invoice for the sender to fill, hence the requirement to be online. The requirement to be online is also a security risk because it means the user's Bitcoin keys are held in a so-called hot wallet, meaning it's connected to the internet. Standard security in Bitcoin has always been to keep the majority of your coins offline in cold storage, while only keeping small amounts in wallets that are connected to the internet. Hackers are far more likely to succeed when targeting hot wallets, which the entire Lightning Network is composed of. The only way to get coins from the Lightning Network into offline cold storage is by making an on-chain transaction. Routing payments through the Lightning Network is another serious problem. Every payment needs to find a definite path from sender to receiver. If Alice wants to pay Donald, but does not have a channel open with him directly, she has to find a route to him through other channels. She might have to send her payment through Bob first, who then sends it to Charlie, because Charlie has a channel open with Donald. If Donald is not well connected enough with the network, if he does not have enough payment channels open with other well-connected parties, the software will not be able to find a path to him, and the payment will fail. But merely finding a route is not sufficient. Each channel along the path also needs to have sufficient liquidity within it for the payment to go through. If Alice wants to send a $100 payment to Donald that routes through Bob and Charlie, but the channel between Bob and Charlie only has $50 of liquidity in it, the payment cannot go through. In practice, this results in frequent payment failures, especially for large value transactions. To understand payment channels better, the best analogy is to that of beads moving along a string. A channel is like a string connecting two people, and the beads are its liquidity. Let's say Alice opens a channel with Bob and puts 50 beads on the string. To pay for coffee, she moves 5 beads from her side over to Bob's. Then to pay for a pack of gum, Bob moves 1 back to Alice. When the payment channel closes, assuming neither person is trying to steal from the other, Alice and Bob will receive the correct distribution of beads based on their final location. If there are not enough beads to process a payment, the network runs into liquidity problems. If Alice and Bob's channel only has 50 beads on it, it's impossible for them to route any payments that are larger than 50 beads. There's simply not enough beads to move. Compounding problems even further. To make a payment on the Lightning Network, a route must be found from Alice to Donald, where every hop has sufficient liquidity, and these balances are constantly in flux. Every time a payment is routed through Bob's channel, its available liquidity changes. Therefore, not only are payment channels constantly opening and closing on the network, but their respective balances are also changing too. Imagine billions of people trying to use this system, each having multiple payment channels open with constantly changing balances. The simple task of routing becomes an extremely complex one, which might even be impossible to solve without widespread centralization of the network. Rick Falvinga, the IT entrepreneur turned Swedish politician, concluded in a series of videos about Lightning, quote, "Mesh routing is an unsolved problem in computer science, especially when you have adversaries on the network. I'm considering the Lightning Network a dead end." It's not going to gain adoption. It's going to remain a toy that will be tinkered with and eventually left by the wayside, end quote. Andreas Brecken, the founder of the popular SideShift cryptocurrency exchange, came to a similar conclusion. I asked him about his experience using Lightning for his business, and he said, quote, routing is a serious problem on the Lightning Network. Payments frequently fail to route, and the way I've tried to mitigate this problem is by being connected to the largest exchanges. But even that doesn't solve the problem completely. I have to use software that estimates the probability of a successful payment, and if the percentage is not high enough, I simply don't send the payment. Frankly, large numbers of Bitcoin users are being tricked into thinking this thing can work. But after having incorporated it into my business, I just don't think it will. From a usability perspective, the best possible outcome for Lightning would be to have totally custodial wallets connected to the largest exchanges. But of course, that kind of defeats the purpose of Bitcoin in the first place, end quote. Brecken is correct. If the Lightning Network is going to have any chance of success among the general public, it will require massive centralization into a hub-and-spoke network and custodial wallets. Centralization is the one reliable way to lessen the severity of the problems with the Lightning Network. Custodial wallets eliminate the burden to run your own node and be online all the time. Routing is easier if everybody connects to the same giant hubs that have enough connectivity and liquidity to service millions of people. If everybody opens a channel with PayPal, then the chances of finding a route are high. Big companies will not merely participate in the Bitcoin economy, users will be forced to rely on them to have basic payment functionality. And just like with custodial wallets, they can easily be censored and cut off from the rest of the network. The centralization of the Lightning Network is inevitable and has been predicted for years. In fact, it's even been the subject of academic research. The structure of the Lightning Network is called a hub-and-spoke model, resembling the spokes on a wheel, where small nodes connect to larger nodes, which are themselves connected to a few supernodes. Figure 3 shows a diagram of the hub-and-spoke network. Crucially, this is not a distributed peer-to-peer network where nodes connect directly to each other. With on-chain payments, Alice has a direct connection of Donald. With Lightning, Alice must go through Bob and Charlie first. The largest nodes become essential to the smooth functioning of the entire network. And these huge nodes will have the power to censor. They will be hosted by companies that are very easy to regulate. And when they are taken offline for whatever reason, due to failure, regulation, or simple maintenance problems, the connectivity of the network will be seriously damaged. Everyday users can be completely severed from the network if their link to a central hub goes down. Alice might not be able to find any route to Donald without being forced to go through the equivalent of PayPal. A group of academic researchers wrote about these risks in a 2020 paper entitled Lightning Network, a second path towards centralization of the Bitcoin economy. They wrote, quote, "The Bitcoin Lightning Network is becoming an increasingly centralized network, more and more compatible with a core periphery structure. Further inspection of the resilience of the Bitcoin Lightning Network shows that removing hubs leads to the collapse of the network into many components, and evidence suggesting that this network may be a target for so-called split attacks." End quote. These researchers then put forward several mathematical and empirical arguments which demonstrate that the centralization tendency is inherent to the network design, and they concluded, quote, "The tendency to centralization is observable even when considering weighted quantities, as only about 10% of the nodes hold 80% of the Bitcoins at stake in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. These results seem to confirm the tendency for the network architecture to become less distributed, a process having the undesirable consequence of making the Bitcoin Lightning Network increasingly fragile towards attacks and failures." End quote. Liquidity problems also add to these centralization pressures, along with the requirement to use a wallet that is always connected to the internet. Most people will not be willing to lock up thousands of dollars in their payment channels, especially because of the increased risk of being constantly online. This means large payments will inevitably be forced to route through large corporate payment hubs that have sufficient liquidity and technical skills to ward off hackers. The inevitable centralization of the Lightning Network is ironic, considering the mad crusade the core developers took to avoid centralization by overhauling Satoshi's original design. Not only is Lightning infinitely more complex and clunky and less reliable than on-chain transactions, the network will end up being orders of magnitude more expensive for every user because the on-chain payments required to use it will cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. And if a user ever gets banned from a central payment hub, they will be forced to make additional on-chain transactions to maintain connectivity to the rest of the network. If these transactions cost thousands of dollars each, then getting banned from the hubs will prevent most people from using Bitcoin at all. With Satoshi's design, the network can be disrupted by an expensive 51% attack. With the Lightning Network, the costs of disruption will plummet. Governments or malicious actors can simply target the largest payment channels. If they can knock out a handful of critical hubs at once, then the network will become virtually unusable. Hash rate is not required at all. The viability of BTC now relies on the development of secondary layers. If the secondary layers cannot deliver cheap, reliable payments, then BTC has no way of scaling, at least not without admitting spectacular failure and raising the block size limit, or by total centralization with custodial wallets, which is akin to not using Bitcoin at all. The way the technology currently stands, the Lightning Network will not be a serious solution to the problem of high on-chain fees, and it will not enable regular people to use BTC in commerce. Payment channels are a neat technology, but they're not a scaling solution. They might be helpful for micropayments, as Satoshi thought, but not for everyday transactions. I want Lightning to live up to its promises, because if it could, then the world would be a better place. But I currently have no reason to believe this will happen. All signs point to it being a failed experiment, an embarrassment to the core developers, and a demonstration that the Bitcoin maximalists pushing this technology as a replacement for on-chain transactions were completely wrong and have misled millions of people. It's hard to imagine a more effective way of disrupting Bitcoin than what actually happened. Over the course of several years, BTC changed from being the best payment system on the internet to a slow, expensive, unreliable one. Satoshi's brilliant design was discarded for the promise of a future technology which has not lived up to its hype. This failure has both innocent and malicious interpretations. Bitcoin's story might simply be an example of bad project management, but given the disruptive power of this technology, it looks more likely that Bitcoin was sabotaged by its enemies.